Hello, everyone. Thank you for putting in the chat where you're from. And it looks like, again, we have women joining us from California to Virginia, from Maine down to Honolulu. So it's great. Thank you all for being here and taking part in this webinar series. My name is the Reverend Carol Pinkham Oak, and I am the director of the Thriving in Ministry program at BTS. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists, but before we do that, I invite you to please join me in prayer. Gracious God, we gather as those called to spread your love, to share your good news, and to serve your people. As we hear among us today ways in which we can do that in whole and healthy ways, feed our ministries so that we may answer all the things you have called us to do and answer them joyfully. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so we have today with us Manuela Castigliegli. Manuela is the research professor who has done this wonderful qualitative research on women clergy. She works with Wellbeing at Work, which is part of Flourishing Ministry at Notre Dame University. And she has received both her master's degree and her PhD from King's College in London, with a special focus on congregational studies, missiology, and youth ministry. She's also particularly interested in ecumenical spirituality and recently completed a research project on the Taizé community. She has served in other theological institutions in Italy, France, and the United Kingdom. So as I like to say, Manuela could do this webinar in English, French, and Italian. So in case we need that. We also then have with us Audrey Scanlan, who is the Bishop of the Diocese of Central Pennsylvania. She comes from Pennsylvania, and she has been in the Diocese of New York and in the Diocese of Connecticut. In Connecticut, she was Canon for Mission Collaboration and Congregational Life. She has served as a rector of 2 yoked congregations and has served other places to create congregational vitality, creative and adaptive use of church buildings, local mission, and community engagement. She's also co-founder of Rhythms of Grace, a worship and formation program for children with special needs. So welcome, Audrey. And we have Altagracia Perez-Bullard. Altagracia is a professor at BTS, and she has come to be with us at BTS with much delight to her students in this past 2 years. She has served as Canon for Congregational Vitality in the Diocese of New York, with church development with both lay and clergy leaders. She has been a community leader, a youth minister, a priest, in addition to New York, in Chicago and Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, she served St. Philip's and Holy Faith, where she led multicultural and bilingual congregations engaged in serving and ministering the wider community. She has 30 years experience as a priest, and now we are celebrating and benefiting from those gifts as she forms students for the ministry in the church at BTS. So thank you all very much. Thank you for being here. And I am going to ask Manuela to start with talking about this particular part of her research.
Okay, to start, I share my screen if I can. The joys of technologies are always with us. There you go. Okay, so as we have read from the title, so that this conversation is really about imperfection, and because this research is very much based on stories, and it tries to honor women's stories. I would like to start with two stories, as we have done previously. These are two clergy women, not literally, but try to imagine them. Growing up, the first is Sandra. She was used to seeing women working in ministry position. They often occupied subordinate or temporary roles, which caused Sandra to hesitate when faced with her own calling. When she finally decided to accept it, she didn't immediately enroll in a seminary. Instead, she worked hard to fill a resume with all sorts of relevant work experiences. She believed that by building an outstanding professional profile, she would be shielded from gender discrimination. In time, she developed a tendency to obsess over the quality of her performance. It took her years to realize that overcompensating for her fears was putting her at a risk of burnout. I had to befriend my humanity, she explained during an interview. I wanted to be the perfect priest, and my years of seminary and ministry became ground zero for the person I am today. I decided to be the best human being I could be, who also happened to be someone who wanted to become a priest. I learned how to come home to myself. The second story that comes from Sarah. Sarah is an energetic and outspoken associate priest. She's young, she's in her mid-30s. A rector has been in charge of their church for many years, and parishioners know they can call him at literally any time of the day or the night. He is comfortable with having very low boundaries, and his typical work week is often between 60 and 70 hours. Sarah has a very open and egalitarian work relationship with her rector, but she struggles to resize her parishioners' poor boundaries and expectations. This challenge is further complicated by the fact that she is new to ministry, young, and a woman in a congregation that has been traditionally led by men. She considers herself a confident woman, but she often questions her performance. To reassure herself and respond to possible criticism, she keeps a very detailed record of what she does every day, but sometimes she asks herself, am I doing a good enough job? In those moments, she looks at her list of daily achievements to soothe her anxiety and remind herself that she is doing enough. Numerous studies have documented the incidence of depression and burnout among clergy. Unfortunately, most research on clergy burnout speaks about ministers in general and does not explore the impact of gender or sexual orientation. Yet, Sandra's and Sarah's stories show that gender dynamics may play a powerful role in shaping clergywomen's ability to define their position, their workloads, and also their boundaries. Studies about women in ministry often speak about a stained glass ceiling, preventing clergywomen from reaching the top levels of leadership. The gender gap is thus reduced to an issue of career perspectives and access to top leadership positions. A more holistic way of thinking about gender inequality in the church as in other workplaces is perhaps to imagine it as a labyrinth of gender-connected barriers acting as multiple levels. One of them has to do with occupational stress, a potential risk factor for burnout. According to recent studies, clergywomen report higher levels of work-related stress than their male counterparts. Generally speaking, ministry is a profession that increases the risk of depression and burnout, and multiple factors can explain this phenomenon. Some have theological roots. Ministry work comes from a belief that ministers are personally called to fulfill God's will, which implies that many clergy struggle to define the boundaries of what they perceive as a profoundly spiritual mission. The very idea of committing one's entire life to serve God also implies that failures may take a deeply personal spiritual significance. Furthermore, ministry is a very complex job. Priests may fill many roles on the same day, often resulting in a fragmented and unpredictable work schedule. These and many other factors connected to the unique nature of the ministry profession explain why clergy report high levels of occupational stress and low levels of engagement in well-being practices. But in women's case, in particular, this baseline risk that is common to all clergy is increased by multiple factors. And we have a very short time, but I want to focus on three factors. They are not the only ones, and we'll probably explore many others during the conversation. The first, for women, ministry is still felt as an ill-fitting robe. In our study, most female participants, at least according to our data, reported perceiving themselves, or more often being perceived by others, as not precisely fitting the role. Scholars call this a contradiction of status. It is an explicit or implicit inconsistency between someone's characteristics and the position they occupy. And this is a recurrent issue, not only with clergy, but also in male majority workplaces. You don't fit exactly there. There is something that is not obvious in the position you occupy. Our female participants often reported being less appreciated and recognized than their male counterparts. Diminishing comments regarding one's gender, physical aspect, tone of voice, ability to perform were pervasive and directly connected to women's self-doubting, fear of failing, overworking, and overall stress levels. Prior research has documented that female ministers perceive substantially lower levels of social support compared to men, and that when male and female clergy enact the very same professional behaviors, congregations are likely to evaluate the female priests less favorably. Unfortunately, multiple studies also show that gender inequality in the workplace has a profound impact on mental health. It has a cumulative impact. Second factor, gender inequality and the ministry job market. Female participants placed in small and declining congregations were more likely to struggle with unpredictable work schedules, financial instability, lack of resources, poor social support. At a personal level, they were more likely to experience family tensions over dual career planning and caregiving roles. And unfortunately, across denominations, women are still disproportionately assigned to small and under-resourced parishes. This is a finding we could see in the three denominations we involved in this study. In our study, an indirect consequence of this persistent job market inequality was that these women reported higher levels of work-related stress. Third factor, being single versus being married. According to our findings, single women experience unique clergies that put them at a particular risk of stress, depression, and burnout. Congregations generally expected or seem to expect a single clergy women, more than men, to grant limitless availability to their demands. And consequently, these women struggle to claim boundaries and justify, quote unquote, off time. Conversely, being a wife and a mother provided a basic legitimization for those claims. That doesn't mean a free card, but it meant that at least they could claim legitimacy to those claims. Despite these concerns, there are good news. Our research clarifies that increased stress levels among women do not necessarily lead to higher levels of depression and burnout. This is a surprising finding because for men, that correspondence exists. Higher levels of occupational stress mean higher levels of burnout and depression. For women, that was not the case. Women's more positive outcomes seem related to a few crucial factors, and I list a few among the possible ones. First, they show a greater focus on mental and spiritual well-being. This across the board, at least in the group we recruited. The overwhelming majority of our female participants had a spiritual director, a therapist, a coach, or a mentor. Since the beginning, clergywomen's inclination to look proactively for well-being resources marked a stark difference from their male peers. Male priests in the same position do not necessarily have the same focus. Among men, the proactive recourse to professional help was extremely rare, at least among our participants. Furthermore, most women formed and maintained intentional connections with informal support networks, often made of women who had undergone similar experiences. Prior research shows that the support networks play a critical role in protecting clergy from the risk of depression and burnout. This is probably the single most important positive factor. Second positive factor, more than men, women claim the boundaries and try to build resilience. Having to reconcile different and sometimes conflicting roles as congregational leader, wife, head of a household, or caregiver, led most women to emphasize the need to set and maintain healthy boundaries between them. And while clergy women with young children, especially during the pandemic, suffered an evident strain, a cultural shift seems to be taking place among younger couples who often share caregiving roles based on pragmatic criteria, irrespective of their gender. As highlighted before, claiming boundaries were particularly difficult for single women and small parish rectors who remained at an increased mental health risk. Multiple clergy studies point out that boundaries and rest are essential to building a minister's psychological, emotional, and physical resilience. Third and last positive factor. Ministry involved learning to befriend one's humanity. This was a very striking finding. For many women, learning to be a minister went in parallel with learning to accept the imperfection and humanity from yourself. Personal theologies play an essential role in legitimizing destructive tendencies or protecting individuals from them. Our study highlights that clergywomen tended to place a particular emphasis on the theme of incarnation and embodiment as expressions of divine grace and presence. This focus was positively connected to attitudes that encouraged self-compassion, self-awareness, vulnerability, and self-care. Especially at the early stages of women's transition into ministry, an essential component of new clergywomen's learning process seemed to be this idea Sandra expresses in her story. I learned to befriend my humanity and learned to diffuse external or internal pressures to perform and be perfect. This finding was particularly striking given the cultural pressures women had to show, to face, and not to show vulnerability, limitations, and failure. My conclusion for now. These findings emphasize certainly clergywomen's ability to face stress, build resilience, protect their well-being, but there is a but. It is essential to highlight that clergywomen continue to face higher levels of work-related stress than their male counterparts, and that this differential is connected to gender-related causes that may be structural, the kind of jobs they get, the small parishes or less resourced positions, or gender-based prejudice, less appreciation, or sometimes also family reasons, gender role reasons. But I want to add finally another caveat to give you an idea of how to read this data. It is crucial to underline that women's greater resilience to stress may also result from self-selection, meaning those women are there because they had to overcome a series of barriers that men did not have to overcome necessarily. The calling stories of the women we interviewed were complex and sometimes challenging, and that it clearly presented us with the evidence that those women had to fight or to overcome obstacles. So The fact that they are more resilient may also be due to the fact that they had to build that resilience through an abnormal resistance to the status they had achieved. So I look forward to the discussion. I'll stop sharing my screen and oops.
Thank you, Manuela.
Okay.
We're going to turn now to some questions for Audrey and Altagracia. And as we go forward, I ask that you put your questions in the Q&A function. It's at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, right to the right of where participants are. So first, Audrey and Altagracia, as you listen to Manuela's research, does it support the experiences that you've observed among women clergy? And if you can share some examples, and are there things that perhaps have been left out in her research? No, either way. Altagracia, why don't you go first?
Okay, thank you. It's good to be with all of you here. One of the things that stood out for me was the experience of women coming into parishes that were calling them as rectors, like you got to be a rector. But I know that this is not just my particular group of friends, but I did have a group of colleague friends that we called ourselves the Sisterhood of the Broken Toys, because there was a sense that we all got to be rectors, but it was after the congregations had gone through several debilitating phases, and the budget wasn't what it used to be, and the monies that used to be counted on were not there. And so that sense that that as women, we are often called, I mean, it's a both end. We're often called to places that are less resourced, that have less choice in terms of clergy. I know that my first parish felt a little bit like, well, I guess you're kind of our consolation prize. And they were clear that I was not their first choice. And I was grateful that people did come back a while later and say, you know what, you really were the best person for this job, which I recognized as affirming me, but also just their own reluctance. I was the first woman to have ever served in that church as a rector. And it was a very traditional parish, so it did not expect to do that. I also really resonated with the women who have gotten through the ordination process and are working in the church have already overcome multiple barriers. And what came to mind was that over-functioning to overcome things is a way of life. So over-functioning is the way you function. And then having to learn that if you're not going to do a sprint, but you're going to do a marathon, you're going to have to start figuring out the balance. And I was grateful that when I was in the Diocese of Los Angeles, they put a lot of emphasis on clergy wellness and self-differentiation and managing of self, because I learned those things when I got there. I didn't know them beforehand. And I do feel that they contributed to my ability to have some longevity in ministry, even though I was in challenging spaces. And I think that was true for my colleagues as well. I don't know, Audrey, if you wanted to share some things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Altagracia. Right on with everything you've said so far. Manuela, I love this research, and I think it's so vital, really, for our current and next generation and the following generations of clergy women as we grow. My point of reference is a little bit different because women have been ordained in the Episcopal Church for 47 years. And yet we have a prayer book that's 42 years old that we still call, what do we call it? The new prayer book, right? So I think that we are still dealing, and certainly people my age, my generation, and older, which is most of the Episcopal Church today, that we're still dealing with cultural metrics and cultural expectations that need to be reset. And so women clergy are still living in a different framework of expectations that make it really hard to transcend that. And so greater resilience is necessary, I think. I have one, I can share a story, but I also have perhaps an incendiary idea to launch, which might get me kicked off this webinar within the first 10 minutes. But I wonder a little bit about if our culture even has the confidence in women clergy, in women priests to be handling matters of our salvation. Because that's what church is about. It's about the livelihood of our souls and our salvation. And this is traditionally, even though churches have been run for generations and generations by the matriarchy, at the head of the heap always is a male. And so I just wonder for future research how you could connect that idea of the importance of the core purpose of church with handing that over to women in a culture that still doesn't respect and honor the capacity of women in those really critical leadership roles. So just a couple of really quick stories to give you a sense of the water that I've been swimming in since I was ordained, sort of microaggressions. I was telling one of my canons yesterday that I was in a hotel here in central Pennsylvania a couple of years ago, and I had traveled up north to visit a parish, and it was Sunday morning, and I had on my purple shirt and my black suit, and I had my little bag, my little suitcase that I was trailing behind me into the elevator. And this guy got onto the elevator with me, and he looked at me and he said, he kind of looked quizzical because I was way up north in the rural part of the diocese. And he said, "So what airport do you fly out of?" He thought I was a stewardess in my weird outfit. It wasn't long after that I was in a hospital, same outfit, same purple shirt, and a woman this time looked at me in an elevator and she said, "Well, you know what, honey? If I had to wear an outfit like that too, I'm glad that at least you can dress it up with a pretty color." So there is just this wild sense of we still don't fit. And so the need to be resilient, the need to set boundaries, the need to form relationships that support us is critical. But I'm going to mute myself now.
And though it's not, one of those things like, wow, that's funny, not funny. But it's like Halloween, I'm reminded because it was just Halloween. Every Halloween, somebody stopped me and said, "Oh, are you dressed as a nun?" And I would have to explain, "No, I'm actually a priest. I'm working today. These are my work clothes." But I think I know how hard it is to overcome a sense that you don't look like an Episcopal priest.
Yeah.
I think for women of color, that's especially either people don't understand why you're in this tradition, or they don't understand that you're a priest in the tradition. And how many meetings did I go to? There was a clergy police association in both my communities actually that I served in Los Angeles. And the third time that I went to the meeting and had to explain that I was not the pastor's wife or the minister of youth, but actually the rector of the church, was the last time I went to the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
A meeting that somebody invited me to and said, "But be careful. Just know that they don't believe in women priests." And I was grateful for my clergy support group because I was able to talk to them about it. And then they would just say things like, "Well, we're not like the tooth fairy. We actually do, you don't have to believe in women priests, like exist." But I do think, and I know that from the research that's been done, like all of these things are compounded by race and class and sexuality. So it doesn't get any less labyrinthy. Like this is one of those labyrinths like in a scary movie where you can't get out, not like the pretty ones that we put in our churches.
Yeah, and I wanted to add very quickly, I thank you, Altagracia, for mentioning the intersectionality factor. That is, we didn't have the time to cover that, but please keep in mind that, I mean, race in particular is a powerful factor in compounding all the disadvantages and all the pressures that I have mentioned, particularly the lack of recognition, sometimes the lack of social support. So these multiply these factors or these problems also for, factors like race and sometimes also sexual orientation. I mean, you were one of the pioneers at Altagracia. There are some younger people today who are just entering the ministry or sometimes take an activist stance, but that doesn't detract from the possible negative backlash they may receive.
And I'm wondering that each of you in your various places, Manuela in her research and Altagracia and Audrey as you work with clergywomen, what are some of the ways in which you've dealt with stress and or maybe passed some of this on to other clergywomen or observed other women who had a particularly effective way of dealing with this stress that builds up? I mean, we may be able to blow off, thought I was a nun, but it still creates stress. So, yeah.
I try in my classes here to really, we're trying to destigmatize issues of mental health because there is still a lot of stigma attached to them. And so trying to name over and over again that in terms of best practices, if you're going to do ministry, it is a best practice that you have a network of support so that you have a colleague group. Or, you have a colleague group, you have a support group, you have a spiritual director, you have a therapist. And when people ask me, like, well, how did you do like ministry in the church all those years? I say, because I had all of them, right? Sometimes I felt like it took more work to keep all the gears running than it did, But the truth is there's no other way to do it because the ministry is isolating. Most of us do not end up working in churches that have multi-staff. I don't think that those women that are in charge of multi-staff church, and they do have colleagues to work with, but I know that there's a certain burden to being the rector of a big church as well, not one that I've ever had. Thank you very much. But I just know that the isolation that comes with ministry then requires us to be especially rigorous and disciplined in that very spiritual disciplined way of ensuring that we have prayer partners, that we have people we do Bible study with, that we have friends that we go to the movies with and go for walks with, like all the different kinds of support. Because especially, I think whether you're partnered or not partnered, all of it has its own version of stress. But I try to say it all the time because I want to normalize it. I don't want it to seem like, oh, you go through so much stress that you need that. No. This is the best practice. A therapist should not be practicing therapy without being in therapy themselves or some kind of supervision. For social workers, I think the same is true for clergy. Like, we have no business being out there by ourselves. There was one Messiah, thank you very much, and we are not it.
Yeah, amen to support groups and colleague groups and spiritual directors and coaches and mentors, all of whom, and spouses and friends, all of whom I think play overlapping roles in our health. When I was preparing for this, I asked myself, well, what exactly causes me stress in my job? What are the sources of my stress? And I could articulate 3 of them. And this is really a personal thing, so everybody's going to have their own thing. But for me, the number one thing that causes me stress is unresolved conflict. When somebody sends an email or makes a low blow at a staff meeting, well, it doesn't happen at my staff meetings, but at a meeting, and there's some conflict there. If I can't resolve that right away or address it or talk to somebody, that causes me huge amounts of stress. And so for me, the way to unload that a little bit is to have a trusted colleague with whom to speak. And I do. I have 2 or 3 really amazing bishop friends, some of them men, some of them women, with whom I share regularly. Another source of my ongoing stress in my position, and I'm sure in a lot of people's jobs, is around time crunch. Like, how am I going to get all of this stuff done? And I get extremely anxious until I sit down and negotiate with myself. Am I going to take an hour at the end of my day off to set myself up for the week ahead by going through emails? Am I going to block out time to write that blog post? Or, those are simple mechanical, technical fixes, but they work for me. And then I would say the third place where I experience a lot of stress in my life is around the need to negotiate boundaries, making sure that I'm not taking on somebody else's work. Manuela, you were talking about overperforming and overfunctioning. I think a lot of us, I certainly tend that way. And so for me, it's always around, is this my work to be doing? Or am I just doing somebody else's work because I'm anxious about getting it done? And so checking in with myself on boundaries is really, really important.
My other thought
There was a,
boundaries, if I could just really quickly.
and I have
my
a
other thought
question
about-
from the chat.
Okay, but about boundaries is that I think the fact that the church itself is so anxious about what it's going to look like in the future, what do we do about resources, and that sense that we may have, and I know I've owned it, that I've got to fix this.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to keep perspective, read material that helps keep perspective, that this, first of all, it's God's church, in that sense, not mine, and that I have to trust that things will, I do my part and everybody does their part, but that feeling that we've got to turn the church around or keep the church going, that's a lot of stress. And I think the boundary keeping and keeping perspective is really important around that. Turn it back over to you, Carol.
So there's a question in the chat that relates to the boundaries, but also relates to working with congregations. And ask the panelists to address a bit more about setting healthy boundaries being a new frontier for congregations and other work settings. How often are we bringing good practices for the first time in a congregation's history? So we've talked a lot about what we do and have done, but what about the people that we're ministering with? And it really being a frontier of them hearing there are boundaries and you didn't need to discuss them with your previous male priests, but it's important to discuss it now.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to express in my opening statement, was that we are sort of in between these sets of cultural expectations that most of the congregants in our churches, at least in my diocese, are 60 plus, and they have a different set of operating expectations. And so introducing healthy boundaries is a real challenge. And yet I think you do it through education, you do it through conversation and dialogue, and you be persistent and predictable.
I think consistency is important, but I also think connecting it to spiritual practices. So trying to help if we have to have meetings on Sunday, that we make a commitment that it's only going to go for so long and that there's going to be a break and that we're not going to try to do everything at one time. Helping them to have days for quiet days, for retreat time, and preaching about that and teaching about that and offering that, because at least, especially in congregations where people are working class folks, they don't have those kinds of, if you get called into work, you want to keep your job, you show up at work, regardless of when the last shift was, right? So I think they sometimes also they think it's some kind of bougie thing that that you get to take this time off or something. So trying to connect it with spiritual principles of Sabbath taking and study and rest, and that, it's a form of idolatry to think that we can just keep going and going and going when God took a day off, right? So trying to help them live into it with some different language.
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to add very quickly. Sometimes it's also very context dependent. related. For instance, I had some rectors who lived in rural areas with a church made of farmers who would not understand the 9-to-5 kind of work schedule. It's not everywhere, but I think what I appreciated in a conversation with our participants is that they tried to make it, as Altagracia was saying, a theological issue. This is try to educate the congregation, especially after years and years in which previous priests may have modeled a different kind of function, and try to make them understand that being a human being implies also, and salvation implies also a bodily dimension that is not dysfunctional. It is something that needs to be taken care of. Try to model like good health and good health practices and speak about them openly, about the needs and about the balance, and make it a part of your teaching is one of the possible ways to go, sometimes to slowly shift the mentality. And sometimes, being frank about personal needs. There were many of the women I interviewed who were not necessarily ashamed of sharing with the church board or whatever other lay leadership they had. This is my life. I need you to understand that there needs to be a mutual agreement. I'm already doing a lot. Many of these women were doing the extra mile. They were covering the extra mile. Anyways, what they were asking for is just a reasoning around matters of well-being. So try to have open communication about that. They seem to be very helpful. But obviously, for many women, one of the pressures was that is what this history, the story with Sandra speaks about, also the relationship with your rector. Many of these women were placed in positions that were in associate positions in which they could not really shape the culture of the congregation. And so they had to try to find the ways to communicate at the same time with the rector, but also with the congregation, with not necessarily a lot of power to change things, because messaging could be very divergent from one to the other leader of the parish. And that remains an open problem. And probably you have, Altagracia and Audrey, you have experienced similar things.
So I'm wondering if any of the three of you can talk about an experience where that happened for a woman clergy person, and an experience with the congregation that was particularly supportive. In other words, it wasn't just the woman clergy shaping the congregation into well-being. The congregation was an active participant in that, and they were supporting appropriately the women clergy.
I think of a specific example, 83% of the jobs in the diocese where I serve are part-time. And half of our clergy are female, but and this points back to some of the research we were talking about, of the top 10 of our 60 some odd congregations that we have, of those top 10 parishes, only 3 of them are led by women. And so the majority of women in the Diocese of Central Pennsylvania are serving in part-time positions, which means that they're bivocational in many cases. Either they have a second career, or they have a family that they have primary caretaking responsibility for children. And so I think that oftentimes I find that our congregations are actually quite sympathetic to that. And they realize, okay, this is Tuesday. This is not the day when our pastor is available to us because she's working her other job, or her child's got soccer practice, or whatever may be happening. And I actually find a great amount of support in our diocese for that, mostly because we are this rural place with lots of tiny little churches with very many part-time priests.
Altagracia, anything you want to add to that before I move us briefly to another topic?
I just found that when I was willing to talk about balance and boundaries, and I know in other places, other women that I've seen who had really excellent boundaries, I learned my boundaries from them. People, it did, I mean, it at first it was like a shock, but then I think it did give people food for thought, and then they would be supported. They would be like, oh, don't you have to go to, even if you were in the middle of things. I also think that the willingness to be flexible and not follow a corporate model in terms of how we serve our churches. So I never did 9 to 5 because that didn't make any sense. All my people were at work during 9 to 5. So like if I was going to work with lay folks and do church things, it meant some evenings, it meant some weekends. But then it really did mean that mornings I could do other things that I didn't, that I feel like sometimes the clergy themselves are the ones that feel obsessed about being at work and then also having to stay at work. And then before they know it, they're exhausted, but it's, I maybe competing values or sense of when it is that you're supposed to be at work. I think flexibility is important. I think we don't have to worry that to be flexible is to not be productive. I think that that's not true. And there's lots of studies in the work world that have proven that that's not true. And so how do we offer ourselves, our best selves, and work with the church so that it not only serves the things that we really need to be doing, but also allows us the time to have that flexibility to take kids to doctor's appointments or care for elderly parents or whatever it is that we're doing.
Okay. So I'm encouraging all our participants to put any questions that they have in the Q&A, and we're going to get to them in just a minute. I have one just more brief, and we may need to gather these after the webinar and send them out to all our participants, but are there any resources that you can name that can be mobilized to support women clergy, like other special programs in addition to the spiritual direction, therapist, colleague group, mentor, coach? Are there particular places that you would, or programs that you would say, this is supportive for women?
I can just, I'm not even sure this continues, but I participated in a series of seminars called Women Empowering Executive Leadership, WHEEL. It was part of Helen Savoba Barber's research. And that was such a wonderfully supportive group of women who came together to talk about how it is that they are functioning in this context of ours. So that's one sort of institutional resource. I'm not sure if it continues today. Oh, she's on the call. Good. She said, yes, you're continuing.
Yes, she is.
Okay, so that's awesome. Altagracia, do you have other institutional resources?
I don't. I mean, thanks to this research and working with Manuela, I'm trying to do the deep dive to begin to collect things that I could share with students and other congregations that might be interested. But I confess, and I think some people on the call will laugh, I really feel the family systems theory saved my life, because I understood, because all the places where both my strength and my vulnerabilities were present, of my giving my all and my intuitiveness and my I'm gonna fix this stuff, all the codependent things. So I think that to be able to see the system differently, and I had a study colleague group that was men and women together that had been at churches that were vulnerable, and it made because it was a colleague study group, and we met regularly, and we were held accountable to our goals and to the work that we were doing with lay folks and with the institution in general. And we were all, rectors of churches. It helped me to model and to gain support while I built those muscles of boundaries, self-care. And I don't know that I would have lasted as long as I did, right? Because it's easy to get eaten up by the distress and anxiety of our congregations. And so that's not particular for women, but it was helpful to me and to the women that were involved in it.
Yeah.
I jump in very quickly just because this is a topic that has to do with resources and people may appreciate that. I just want to emphasize for those who are in seminaries, and still working on their degrees, please make friends among your seminary classmates. It was amazing for me to see how much those friends continue to matter throughout all your journey as priests. Many, I would say that the overwhelming majority of the people we interviewed had very strong connections with their classmates. And those connections were real lifesavers. So they provided a basic network through thick and thin throughout the ministry for years to follow. Second, try to find ways. I'm surprised that, and I truly wonder why there are not more organized kind of opportunities to do that. But most of the the women to women networks we came across were informally created. They were created by personal initiative. There is one big network that is the Young Clergywomen International that many younger women mentioned that is really, really powerful in terms of impact. But the problem is that you are kicked out after 40. And many women are entering ministry when they are 40. So if there was any way to facilitate a network of women that they can select partners or in the dialogue by themselves, but at least to find a kind of square, probably through Facebook or any other means that may help find connections and create those communities, that would be great.
So Altagracia, the research that you're doing also in the flourishing in ministry bears that out. And we expanded out in a lot of the peer learning communities and peer learning groups that have come from out of that research and how important they are for women.
And again, spiritual directors, mentor, therapist. I was pleased to see, at least in the sample we had, that mental health was not considered necessarily as just in terms of deviancy, but as a preventative kind of practice. Women were seemed to be very much aware of the need for them to have someone outside the professional circles to whom they could work, with whom they could work. So very big and important resource. So these things are some of the basics really that seem to really to provide powerful help, and it made it
great.
I would also put in just a word for both coaching and mentoring, and they're two really different things. In the House of Bishops, we have a coaching program that we engage in the first 3 years, and I actually had a male coach for my first 3 years, but I've since then coached 2 women now that I'm an older bishop. Well, I was old when I started, but older yet. But that coaching relationship can be very helpful. And mentoring is also really helpful to find somebody whose work, male or female, that you value and somebody you have watched, whom you respect. And there are times when I call up my mentor and say, help me figure out what to do, because I don't want to be coached by this. I just want to be mentored for a moment. And it can be a really intimate and supportive and lovely experience to have somebody like that in your life.
Great. Yeah. I'm all for mentoring, and I'm all for coaching, but particularly mentoring, because it's a long arc of a relationship. There's some questions in the Q&A. A couple of them we've been able to answer from lifelong learning. I'm going to run through some of them, and then in the little time we have left, hopefully we can touch on one of them. One person commented, as I set boundaries, lay leaders, many men leave the church because the boundaries prevent them from controlling what they have historically been allowed to do in church. How do we creatively have a healthy community where boundaries are the norm and not the exception? So let's flag that one. What are the ways congregations or dioceses can create or support culture for ministers to defend their own humanity? And one, what kinds of tools are dioceses using to help counter the idea that churches searching for a new rector isn't ready for a woman? So a couple of these are at diocesan, or, that we're still hearing a church isn't ready for a woman. But the one I hope we can just spend just a few minutes on in conversation, and we'll get answers to the other ones. This questioner asks, I would love to hear more about a theology of imperfection and vulnerability. And it says, Manuela, thank you for your research. But thoughts, and yes, this is not thought out academic thoughts, but any thoughts that you may have in our few minutes that we've got left. Theology of imperfection and vulnerability.
I do think that an emphasis on the priesthood of all believers and being able to encourage folks to understand that all of us have roles in the church, and that all of us that are engaged in this proclaiming of good news need each other to, in a healthy way, live into our role. I think that that's part of the shift that needs to happen from a model of father knows best or mother knows best. And I think it does also mean disciplining ourselves to coach and mentor the leaders in our congregations, as opposed to always just stating what we think it'll be, like being willing to take people through a process that helps them to dig deep and come to consensus around what things we're going to do, what order we're going to do them in, what priority, how we're going to organize our budget, just all the things. And it's not because, and I do think that you get pushback. I remember very sadly, quite clearly, the first evaluation I got, which was, spontaneous, no plan. The senior warden was feeling a lot of pressure, pulled me aside right before my baby shower and said that everybody thinks that I don't have any leadership skills because I don't tell them what to do. So it took that church a while, right? But by the end of my time, they were able to say, you really pulled us up and took us with you. After I cried and then went to the baby shower and enjoyed it, and then went back, it costs us something, but because I'm glad to be bossy and tell people what to do. But I do think that it is needing to value highly the collaborative work, and then to show how in the Bible, that's what we're called to, is to be a community that serves, not that the priest is running everything.
Yeah. Audrey, any thoughts?
Yeah, I love the word experimentation, and we are trying very hard in our diocese to kind of promote a culture of experimentation, which says that failure is okay. And if you do that again and again and again and say, we're going to try something on, we don't know how it's going to go. We're going to approach it with curiosity, and we're going to learn from it after it's over, whether it works out the way we think it will or it doesn't. I think that really, really helps us with dealing with issues of what we would say success or failure. So I'm all about, try it on, see how it goes. And if it doesn't come out how you thought it was going to come out, well, now what? And what did you learn?
Right.
Yeah.
You always learn something and you can take it forward.
My favorite line in the Diocese of New York would be, they said, well, but we tried some things and it didn't work. I said, well, how many things did you try? And they would be like, well, we tried these 2 things. I said, yeah, you didn't try enough things until you've tried 20 things, 20 different things in different ways, then you'll find the right thing. Nobody wants to hear that. They want quick answers, quick solutions.
So Manuela, do you want to sum us up? You were going to give us some closing comments as we finish our time together.
Well, no, not really. I think the conversation was very rich, and I'm very, very thankful to Audrey and Altagracia for bringing all the richness of their experience to this conversation again. I appreciate the question about imperfection, because I think that is an edge that takes the courage for women to model imperfection, because they are playing a high stake game, and they sometimes risk backlash. What this was not just a research for me, was a really spiritual journey in a way. And I was touched by seeing how much courage many women used from the pulpit in teaching, reminding people that parish life, church life is not about, some people use the term the cult of niceness, the cult of appearances. It is, we function on Sunday morning in a certain way. We don't show too much. They try to deconstruct that. They try to bring the reality of church life to the nitty gritty of being human, being imperfect, and recognizing that, and speaking openly about our failures. And sometimes don't feeling the need to present a perfect appearance during church meetings or in church relationships. And I find that brave. I didn't feel that many men felt the pressure, but I felt that the women felt that burden, that they needed to deconstruct the facade and go. And probably many men feel the same kind of passion, but women in particular were very outspoken about going beyond the mirror, the looking mirror, if you want, and try to gain some truth in relationships in church life. And that truth has to do also with vulnerability and with the fragility of being human beings, including further. It's easy to surrender to the idea of power and the priest to be someone who is perfect and on a pedestal. Some priests we talked to were terrorized by this idea of being put on a pedestal, because the pedestal, yes, gives you power, but at the same time puts you in a position in which you can't possibly express any vulnerability. And they actively tried to deconstruct that, many of them. And so I found a lot of encouragement in those stories. They are really trying hard, and they need to be supported for that.
Thank you. Well, Manuela, thank you for sharing this section of your research with us and for creating the conditions for such a rich conversation. I've got several topics noted down here that I'd love to explore more, and we'll look into how we might do that. And Audrey, thank you from your perspective of years of ministry in the parish, and both as a diocesan leader. And Altagracia, thank you for your perspective as a person who has been in the trenches in parishes, but also now has an opportunity to teach about that. So I'm grateful for all of you for being here. And I believe Lifelong Learning has a slide for our next webinar, which is coming up in December. Our next webinar, Keys to Authenticity and Integrity as Women in Ministry, and that will be December 1st at 3 p.m. So for all of you who have been here today, thank you for joining us. If you know someone who's missed this, it will be available on a recording, and we can keep sharing what we've all learned here with one another. So thank you all very much.